Hey, I'm back. So I wanted to kind of continue on the topic that I've been discussing. Started with the "What is Subculture" video and the homology hypothesis video, which was the most recent one. I'll link both of those in the description here. But sort of the idea of how do we uh, determine, demonstrate, define, delineate between culture, identity, and what goth is and where that kind of all comes together. And as I've been having these discussions online talking about my homology hypothesis, trying to get a feel for how people feel about that, how it's structured, all those nuances, I've been watching this recent discussion online about goth music. And I'm sure you have as well, at least specifically on YouTube. So essentially, for a long time online, not just on YouTube, there were a lot of people who would talk about how goth music is not necessary for one to be a goth. And that's been around for a while. And recently on YouTube, there have been a lot of videos. Everyone's been throwing their opinion in on what role music plays in the subculture and in personal identity. And as I've been watching that discussion, it seems to have even more recently moved from music being a necessary component to music being the only component. And I kind of wanted to address this, but in a different way. I think that argument, well, first of all, that argument I very specifically address in the upcoming episode of Cemetery Confessions. The article we cover states that as well, and I try to address that specifically. I won't as much in this video. But I will say I think it falls into the same trap as You Don't Need Goth Music kind of does, in that it empties goth or goth music of its component parts, of the substantive elements that make up the culture and make up the music, and ignores how robust goth has become over the years and how it's evolved and kind of picked things up as a revivalist movement. I talked about how the Gothic is a revivalist movement and how goth is as well in another video, so I won't go into that. But I think reducing goth simply to music not only makes it fragile, but I don't think it's a model that can support how meaningful and how diverse goth culture is. And it also, by the same token, allows non-goths who enjoy goth music to therefore be called goths. And that is a thing. I remember the Bauhaus tour I went to, reunion tour. Well, it was only Peter, but I think they still called it a reunion tour. Many years ago, the crowd there at the House of Blues in Chicago was maybe probably about 70% non-goths, which surprised me. But by that argument, those people who simply enjoy the music and the history and the 80s and all of those bands that go with goth but have none of the other subcultural markers could therefore still be called goths. And I think that's a problem implicit with that model. But what I would like to look at specifically and hopefully quickly is the idea or the notion that even in the early 80s, when goth was coming out of the music, there were still more elements to not just the music, but the artists, and more importantly, the people who enjoyed the music that made up the crowd, and kind of tried to demonstrate that perhaps more of a simplistic or maybe just different version of my homology hypothesis was present in the 80s. And that simply means, if you haven't seen that video, the most basic definition is that goth is a component of several parts, and that the coming together of several different elements make up a goth identity. And there's some distinctions there between how that is defined from a cultural perspective and how that's defined from a personal identity construction perspective. But again, I'll link those videos below. So I'd like to kind of build a case for goth, even in its inception, being more than simply a musical tonality, but a grouping that incorporated a distinct cultural milieu that was informed by and a reaction to various cultural influences of the time that drew on the Gothic of the past, literature and philosophy and art, as well as a performative aesthetic, and that all of these elements developed coterminously or at the same time and informed one another. They were you couldn't separate them from one another. And as an aside, if you haven't seen the film B movie, it's B movie Lust, Sound, and Something in West Berlin. I don't remember the exact title. But that's a good film to kind of demonstrate the more political side of this, and sort of how apparent culture had an influence. I have one quote from a book here I'd like to read in regards to that. But you can see in that film how the socioeconomic status, the political environment, and just the state of culture informed goth music and youth identities in much more of a reactionary countercultural way, and how it wasn't simply this is just a cool sound that we're exploring and experimenting with, but really was a form of resistance. So I highly recommend that. That adds some more depth there. But this quote I want to read is from the book The Music of Goth Subculture, Postmodernism and Aesthetics by Charles Mueller. And he says, another characteristic that defined the 1980s was, according to Jenkins, a tendency for political leaders and the public to discuss social issues with a rigid, uncompromising, black and white, us versus them mentality. Jenkins felt that Reagan and Thatcher set the tone for all discourse in their respective countries by characterizing not only the Cold War as a struggle between good and evil, but social problems like drug abuse, crime, and poverty as well. Subcultures like goth could be seen as a backlash or counterpoint to this type of thinking by so self-consciously casting themselves in the role of an extreme other with their exaggerated makeup and discordant music. The goth themes in the music and image of the subculture, with frequent references to the supernatural, are perhaps understandable since political leaders were continuously describing social problems in equally fantastical and metaphysical terms. And hopefully that film and this quote can kind of, in a concise way, paint a picture of how broader culture and political environments interpolated goth music and goth culture and how those influenced it. So I'm going to link a couple other videos because you can listen to me talk, but it's, I think, much more impactful if you actually see people of the time demonstrating that goth music at least is influenced by various other elements that I'll get into. This first video is a short interview with Susie and a couple other people, and it's from 1976, and in it they both demonstrate through their appearance and through their words how important sartorial idioms or appearance is to their art and to the music, and how that informs what they're doing. So that will be a link down there. There's going to be another link to a video that is an interview with several different goths from the 80s, and this sort of establishes that the identity. I'm sorry, this is for one goth, Valerie. This is taken from a longer film. But it's an interview with someone, a goth from the 80s, and it basically demonstrates that her identity is informed not just by music, but it's tied to her sexuality and her philosophical lens and her resistance to sexual norms, which again paints a broader picture of sort of ideologies, philosophies, lifestyles, all informing one another and coming together with music to create a goth identity. So another a good example or reference point of this, of course, is Bowie, and obviously Ziggy Stardust with his androgynous gender bending and performativity. He inspired a lot of early post-punk artists. So musicians like Peter Murphy, Ian Curtis, I think I have some written down. Steve Strange, Gary Newman, Robert Smith, the Psychedelic Furs, Nick Cave, and more. All of these people were influenced by his music, of course. Musically, he was incredibly innovative, but visually as well. And you'll find quotes from all of these musicians that essentially created the goth genre, talking about how that sort of subversive and transgressive performativity enabled them to live out their lifestyle and to let their art be informed by something that was subversive to gender norms, to sexual norms, just generally heteronormative culture. And it also establishes just how important semiotic expression was, how the look and the symbols of the culture held meaning, held substantive purposes that were outward expressions of philosophies or of subcultural norms, and that kind of thing. And this, again, lends itself to a more robust understanding of goth culture in the early 80s, or post-punk, or, the sort of primordial soup that all of that came out of. In the paper, Goth Music, The Sounds of the Uncanny, they argue that Paul Hodkinson's notion of consistent distinctiveness, along with stylized club rituals like dance movements, literally dance movements, active collaborative processes, absinthe and record rituals, and the general goth milieu support the process of individual sense of self and group identity, which enact a subcultural substance, which is supported by but goes beyond the music. Again, showing how the music is a core, but is informed and supported by other cultural elements. Now we can demonstrate this specifically with some music. I pulled just a few random examples together while I was making a couple notes here, because you do have seminal bands and singles that were frequently mined Gothic imagery. So, for example, Cabaret Voltaire, the name of the band and the music was inspired by the Dada movement, as was much of the early 80s post-punk performance art. The bassist for the Fields of the Nephilim stated in an interview that the band's interest in the occult and 18th century mythology was something of an English tradition. So they drew on those on religious and mysticism and ancient philosophies for their music. Early bands like Dead Can Dance often based their lyrics on ancient philosophies. Bands like Exmal Deutschland and Two Witches drew on occult themes. Psychic TV even incorporated this into a whole separate community. And many bands like Psychic TV, the Nervous Gender, the Screamers, etc., produced video content and zine, magazine content, and other media forms that were outlets for prose and poetry and art and sexual deviance and other elements that were made up a substantive lifestyle, which was supported and made possible through music at the time. But a lot of bands did that. A lot of bands put out other media. Even just album art often held a lot of meaning. The famous Bauhaus cover was taken from the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. That's not just because they thought it looked cool. It holds a deeper meaning than that. Let's see what else. So yeah, and sticking with Bauhaus, I guess, of course, obviously Bela Lugosi's dead. Yeah, it's about vampires. It draws on our affinity for the Gothic, but the vampire mythos and the vampire itself is a symbol of embracing the monstrous other, of gender blurring itself, of sexual deviance, of being apart, being other. Even more saliently in a consumerist culture, I think there's an argument to be made there. What else? Dream Within a Dream by Propaganda is based on a poem by Poe. Obviously, Poe is read and loved by many Goths, and his themes of morbidity and exploration of the human condition adds another layer of complexity that's been there with Goth since its inception. Joy Division's Atrocity exhibition is a direct reference to J.G. Ballard's collection. The Cure's Killing an Arab was inspired by Albert Camus's The Outsider. The Velvet Underground's Venus and Furs is named after the novel and was covered by Christian Death, and there's plenty more examples like this. Next is going to be another video, which I'll link. It's an interview. I think it's a documentary, actually, a short 8-minute video about the Batcave. But in it, you have Ollie from Specimen and other just various attendees of the Batcave describing how their identity is informed by various philosophies, and they name various philosophies, and they talk about how their behaviors and their aesthetic identifiers and cultural values and behaviors coexist and inform the community involved around the music. And the Batcave is a great example because that was kind of the first or the most well-known community of people that came together regularly around goth music that had been trying to find its voice and innovating the like 2 to 5 years prior, however you want to make out that timeline. So I'll have that video linked as well. So what I'm trying to demonstrate again is just hopefully how that goth has always been more robust than simply the music, and to reduce goth only to music makes it infinitely more fragile than it would be otherwise. And I think that's actually what those people are trying to avoid. They're trying to make it more meaningful and more give it some longevity, and I think it's actually doing the exact opposite. It's too reductionist. And I think that makes goth more prone to acculturation and commodification. And we have seen several subcultures sort of subsumed by the mainstream because they weren't as robust as goth. And again, goth has undeniably evolved over the years, just from the early to late 80s, and then late 80s to early 90s and so on. We see cultural shifts. There are entire websites and books dedicated to chronicling this. And it hasn't only been a shift in cultural values, but it has been an increasing of how robust the culture is. I keep using that word. So yeah, I guess my contention is that goth was never only about the music. I don't want to downplay the music though. The music, goth music, especially in the early 80s, was of paramount importance. Is it tantamount? The utmost importance. It was the main driver, the main innovator. There are just as many books written or more about goth music as there are about goth culture. Although my point is that those books don't leave out the other elements that informed the music, and how those impacted goth culture. But I certainly don't want anyone to get the idea. And I think even still today, goth music is the most important aspect of goth. But there's no denying it certainly was in the early 80s. So I do, speaking of books, I pulled a couple quotes here. I just grabbed some books off my shelf and flipped through some sections I vaguely remembered that kind of supported this or illustrated, further build my case. So these are in no particular order. So the first one is the book by Andy Harriman, called Somewhere Leather, Somewhere Lace. If you listen to the podcast, you will know all about this book. Andy's been on the show several times. So let's see. She says here, the idea of dramaticism is one of the universal ideas that is centered around post-punk and goth. Theory from Paris, France says the show was both on stage and in the audience. The fans of the music were works of art in their own right, with backcombed hair and blacked out eyes. Alongside the unrelenting stage presence and costume of the bands and their dark symphonies, the genre managed to hold its own with little commercial success. The word dramatization will arise several times through the book, as it is one of the significant factors of the youth in their music. It is only appropriate. So that's what I wanted to read there. So again, philosophical aesthetic, dramaticism. Philosophical aesthetic is essentially the outward expression of the filter through which we view the world. So when you dress in a goth dress, that presentation, that performativity is implicitly an example or a outward expression of the filter through which you view your world, how you kind of construct your world, the things you surround yourself with, and that how you construct your identity. So that kind of illustrates how not just the fashion, but something deeper than just the fashion, the meanings behind the fashion, interpreted the music. And if you want to know more about sort of the deeper meanings behind the fashion, again, check out the upcoming Cemetery Confessions episode. It's going to be the one about fetish and kink. So this is the book Art of Gothic by Natasha Scharf. And in this forward little section I want to read is by Andy Sexgang. And Andy says, I don't have good lighting in this room, guys. Sorry. What has since become known as Gothic in modern culture stemmed from art house. It was not about following a set of rules and restrictions, but about the freedom of individual expression that flowered from a love of darker philosophical aspects of music, literature, film, and architecture. Then, as now, there were pioneering bands and artists who were pure and original, and those who followed through once the floodgates had opened. I have always felt that one's expression through any art form and lifestyle must be exactly that, a true expression of your very being. To me, Gothic is about being artistically challenging and culturally subversive. Andy Sexgang, someone who was there. Next, this is a quote from Gothic Dark Glamour. I don't remember the author's name. Valerie Steele and Jennifer Park. Let's see what I have here. So they start talking about Bauhaus and Bela Lugosi's dead, and they say to enhance. Where's the start of this sentence here? Gothic rock also employed synthesizers and other modulated effects to enhance the drama of the composition, but beyond the music was the genre's highly significant visual break with the established punk aesthetic. Melancholy and the macabre, central themes of Gothic rock. And I would point out, melancholy and the macabre are philosophically significant. They're not just, oh, I like to think about death and be sad. That's sort of the teenager version of that. Not sure if I'm still recording. Okay. Sorry, guys. My computer froze for a good 15 seconds there. We'll see if I can edit that or not. Melancholy and the macabre, central themes of Gothic rock, became embodied in a new Gothic look, inadvertently created by the influential progenitors of the Goth scene, namely Susie and the Banshees, The Cure, and Bauhaus. Susie Sue, Peter Murphy, and Robert Smith of The Cure preferred deathly pallor enhanced by graphic... that's a word I don't know. And wore uniforms of black that were influenced by all things sinister. From 18th century Romanticism to the tragedy and glorious excess of the Weimar Republic to the surrealist poetry and prose of Antonin Artaud, Goth's godparents drew diverse inspiration from history, art, and literature. Underlying those disparate movements were fundamental themes of suspense, longing, and despair. There go my very expensive books. I do this in one take, guys, so this is what you get. This is from the book Gothic Rock by Mick Mercer, who is a very influential music journalist. And I did not mark down which section I wanted to read. Okay, so he's talking about this book essentially goes through a whole list of goth bands, but he's talking about why he included not just goth bands. So he says, I've also tried to involve goths themselves, not merely because it is for them, but because it's about them. Without them, there would be no goth, not in terms of audience numbers, but because goth was the crowd, the atmosphere. That's also why Adam Ant and John Fox fit in. Romanticism, fear, love, and prickly sexuality, and understated, sharp imagery began there. It isn't so evident nowadays, and that's not nostalgia, merely fact, but when drawing a line, truth becomes more obvious. Again, music and the culture influenced by philosophy and various artistic endeavors. And this last quote is from Goth, the Design, Art, and Fashion of a Dark Subculture. And what do we got here? I don't have any good bookmarks. I have fucking napkins. So I believe this one. In 1982, a new club called the Batcave opened in London's Dean Square. which was to have a major impact on transforming a small clique of the city's Goths into a much larger national movement. The club itself was almost a parody of everything Gothic. Black plastic. No, I don't think that's what I wanted to read. Since the very early days, Goth fashion has consisted of individuals creating their own version of the aesthetic, with the broadest of influences to draw on, from ethereal darkness and haunting madness to monstrous creatures and vampiric fiction. There has never been a clear-cut style that distinguishes between individuals genuinely fixated on Gothic themes and those who have laterally latched onto the Gothic and simply enjoyed dressing up in some erotically charged Rocky Horror Show theatrical outfit. Yeah, and then she kind of goes on to talk about the importance of fashion to attendance at the Batcave and how that informed social identity for the youths that were there, and that just it kind of demonstrates that again, there was another element present, and that was fashion. So hopefully, I know it kind of fell apart at the end there. Hopefully, I've been able to build a case for Goth as a homology, even from the very earliest inception, and demonstrated that you cannot reduce Goth culture from a sociological perspective or Goth identity from just a personal perspective down to a single element. And that is hopefully where we start. So how do we build out from there? And how do we define those things? Well, you can check out the 2 previous videos where I kind of lay out what my working model is, and this model that I've based off of not just personal experience, but the decades of sociological research that have been done, all of that I've read, their ethnographic data that they have, and the various sociological frameworks that they use to interpret the data. I've tried to boil that down to kind of build my own model to explain Goth culture specifically. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. I thought this would be shorter, but it was another long one. If you enjoy this type of discussion, please check out the Cemetery Confessions podcast. You can actually listen to those episodes now on this YouTube channel, and you can identify which ones those are by their long runtime, and simply the photo is of the Cemetery Confessions logo. Or you can get it on your podcast app. You can go to the belfry.rip, where we have a whole panoply of podcasts relating to Goth culture and other tangential subcultures. So thank you again for hanging out with me for a little while. Please leave a comment and let me know your thoughts. I love reading those. That's it. Stay dark, everyone.